It is the evening of December 29th, 1980,
A Monday.
and we are deep in the piney woods of East Texas. This is a region that, it feels very distinct from the rest of the state. It's all thick forests, damp air, and these roads that just tunnel through walls of pine.
The location is specifically on the outskirts of Dayton, Texas. Meteorological records from that evening confirm the conditions. The temperature was dropping and the humidity was high.
And that humidity is relevant, isn't it?
It is. It affects the propagation of sound and light in the atmosphere. The visibility was clear, but that environmental dampness really does play a role in what follows.
Right. So the holiday season is winding down, the air is cold, and the ground is soft from recent rains. This isn't the wide open desert landscape you might picture, like Roswell. This is almost claustrophobic. It's a wooded, dense landscape.
Exactly.
And moving through this dark, damp landscape is this heavy piece of American steel, a 1980 Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme. Inside are three people who are, well, they're about to drive directly into a biological and an illegal nightmare. We have Betty Cash, who is 51 years old, a businesswoman.
We also have her friend, Vicki Landrum, 57, a grocery store employee.
And in the back seat is Vicki's grandson, 7-year-old Colby Landrum.
And this demographic profile is absolutely essential to the credibility of the case.
Why is that?
Well, these weren't thrill seekers. They weren't individuals with a history of seeking any kind of publicity. They were, working class civilians. They were just returning from a very mundane activity eating dinner at a truck stop.
Just going home.
Just going home. And they were on a secondary road, FM 1485, heading toward a very, very isolated stretch of pavement.
And, this isn't a ghost story. It's not about lights that blink out when you turn your head. This is a biography of physical injury. This is a story about blisters and hair loss, and eventually a lawsuit filed against the United States government for $20 million.
A staggering amount.
So our mission here is to reconstruct the Piney Woods incident, also known as the Cash Landrum affair. We aren't just looking at the object they saw. We are looking at the medical charts, the radiation reports, and the court transcripts that followed.
And we must be precise here. This case is a real outlier in the study of these kinds of aerial phenomena.
How so?
Usually the burden of proof is on the witness to prove an object even existed. Here, the existence of something is corroborated by physical scars. The entire question shifts from what did they see to what did it do to them?
So let's get into the car with them. It's approximately 9 p.m.
9 in the evening.
Betty Cash is driving. Vicki is in the passenger seat. Colby in the back. And they're navigating this 2-lane blacktop road completely surrounded by dense oak and pine. It's pitch black. There are no streetlights out here.
This isolation is it's a double-edged sword for any investigation.
Right.
On one hand, it completely eliminates light pollution, which makes any aerial object very distinct. But on the other hand, it severely limits the pool of immediate, corroborating witnesses, especially during the initial minutes of the event.
So as they're driving, they're about 35 miles northeast of Houston, and they spot a light.
Just a single light.
A light above the tree line. And at first, they don't react with fear. They react with logic. They assume it's an airplane.
Which is a completely rational psychological filter. They're roughly 35 miles from what was then Houston Intercontinental Airport.
Okay.
At that distance, at that altitude, a landing light from a commercial airliner or, maybe a private Cessna is by far the most probable explanation. The brain just tries to fit the anomaly into a known pattern.
But the pattern breaks. They keep driving. The road winds, the trees break, and then the light appears again. But this time, the distance has just collapsed. It isn't a strobe on the horizon anymore. It is right there. And it is overwhelmingly bright.
And the descriptions provided by the witnesses, they shift at this stage. They go from describing a light to describing a structure.
Yes.
This is the exact point where the account diverges from any standard misidentification. They start to describe a massive diamond-shaped object.
And I want to be really clear on the shape. They didn't say saucer or cigar. They were absolutely adamant. It was an upright diamond.
Specifically, a lozenge shape with a flattened top and bottom. This is a crucial detail. In 1980, the popular cultural image of a UFO was still, largely dominated by the disc or the saucer.
The classic shape.
The classic shape. This diamond configuration is rare in the literature, which lends a certain authenticity to their description. I mean, they weren't mimicking something they saw in a movie.
And this object wasn't flying, not in a traditional sense. It was hovering just above the treetops. And the scale of it, they compared it to the Dayton Water Tower.
which implies something the size of a multi-story building.
Just floating right over the road.
If we accept their size estimation, we are dealing with an object of immense mass. For something that large to maintain a hover at such a low altitude, it requires a tremendous amount of downward thrust.
And that thrust was visible. This, for me, is the most terrifying part of the whole encounter. It wasn't silent, it was angry. They reported that flames were shooting out of bottom of this diamond.
The mechanism they described suggests a very direct correlation between that thrust and its lift.
So,
They stated that a cone of fire would blast downward and the object would then rise sharply.
it was pushing itself up.
Exactly. And when the flames subsided, the object would drift back down toward the canopy almost as if it were incredibly heavy and was, struggling to stay airborne. This indicates a propulsion system that was either malfunctioning or was operating under some kind of extreme load.
Wow. And inside the Oldsmobile, the environment changed instantly. It wasn't just the light blinding them, it was the temperature. The heat began to penetrate the windshield, the metal roof of the car.
This is the beginning of the biological exposure.
Yeah.
Thermal radiation was transferring directly through the vehicle's chassis.
So Betty Cash brakes. She brings the car to a complete halt. And you have to ask yourself, why stop? Why not just floor it and get out of there?
Because she was trapped.
Trapped how?
The road, FM 1485, is narrow, and the shoulders are just unpaved dirt. And remember, it had been raining.
The ground was soft mud.
Soft mud.
Yeah.
Betty Cash was driving a heavy, rear-wheel drive American sedan. If she had attempted a U-turn on that narrow, muddy road, especially under panic conditions, she would have almost certainly bogged the car down.
And been stuck there.
Stranded. Directly under the object.
Yeah.
Stopping was likely her only safe vehicular option.
So they're just sitting there, idling on the asphalt. The object is ahead of them, hovering, blasting fire. The heat is rising. And then Betty Cash and Vicki Landrum. They make a decision that seems baffling in hindsight, but, maybe it speaks to the shock of the moment. They get out of the car.
And by exiting the shielded environment of the vehicle, they increase their exposure significantly. This aligns with the fight, flight, or freeze response, or perhaps just a desperate need to assess the threat more clearly than the windshield allowed.
Colby, the 7-year-old, he's in the back seat, and he is absolutely terrified. He's screaming. And Vicki Landrum, the grandmother, she's trying to process this through the only lens she has. She's a devout, born-again Christian. He looks at this diamond in the sky, she sees the fire, and she doesn't think aliens. She thinks revelation.
It's a coping mechanism. She told the child, "That's Jesus. He will not hurt us." She was framing the trauma in a theological context to calm the boy, and likely herself. It just shows how the human mind grasps for familiar narratives when it's faced with the completely inexplicable.
But Betty Cash, she is mesmerized. She's standing by the driver's side door, just staring up at this thing. Jerome Clark, who chronicled this event extensively, describes her as being almost in a trance.
She's just bathed in this light and this heat.
For how long?
That exposure duration is critical. Betty was outside the vehicle the longest. Vicki got back in much sooner to comfort Colby. This differential in exposure time directly correlates to the severity of the medical symptoms they each developed later.
So it's like a dose.
It suggests a dose-response relationship to whatever energy the object was emitting.
And the heat became just unbearable. We're not talking about a warm summer breeze. We're talking about radiant heat strong enough to physically heat the metal of the car body.
So much so that when Betty finally snapped out of it and went to get back in, the door handle was too hot to touch.
She had to use her coat sleeve, like an oven mitt, just to open her own car door.
That claim is actually supported by physical evidence found later inside the vehicle. Vicki Landrum stated that when she braced herself against the dashboard, the vinyl had softened.
Softened? You mean like it was melting?
Pliable. Her hand pressed into the dashboard, and because the vinyl had reached a state of plasticity from the ambient heat, it left a permanent impression of her hand.
No.
Weeks later, investigators documented this handprint. It serves as tangible proof that the vehicle was subjected to an extreme thermal anomaly that night.
So imagine the atmosphere inside that car now. The air conditioning is useless. The metal is radiating heat like an oven. A massive object is roaring and blasting fire just yards away. And then the dynamic changes. The object begins to move.
It began a controlled descent. It rose over the tree line, creating distance.
But as it rose, the sky filled up with something else. And this is where the Cash Landrum case pivots. It goes from a UFO story to something more like a government conspiracy story. Because as the diamond moved away, the cavalry arrived.
This is the second phase of the timeline, the intercept.
Helicopters, and not one or two, a swarm of them. The witnesses reported hearing this heavy, rhythmic thumping of rotors. They looked up and saw them converging on the diamond from all sides.
And the witnesses were very specific about the count.
They were.
They tallied 23 individual helicopters. In terms of aviation logistics, putting 23 helicopters in a tight formation over a rural area at night. That's a massive, complex operation. It implies a high level of coordination and a pre-existing flight plan.
And these were not, standard news choppers. Betty and Vicky identified them as Chinooks.
The Boeing CH-47 Chinook. It is visually unmistakable.
Right.
It has that tandem rotor configuration, one large blade system at the front, one at the back. It looks like a long flying bus. These are heavy-lift military transport aircraft. They are loud, they create a massive downwash, and they are exclusively government assets.
And Betty Cash was adamant about what she saw on the side of those helicopters. She claimed she saw the words United States Air Force.
Now, that detail is contentious, but it's very important for the legal battle that comes later. While the Air Force does use helicopters, the CH-47 is primarily an Army asset. However, in the chaos, amidst all the noise and fear, just seeing military markings is the key takeaway. She identified them as ours.
So the Diamond moves off, surrounded by this swarm of 23 Chinooks. The road is finally clear. Betty puts the Oldsmobile in gear. They're terrified. They're sweating. The car is baking hot. They drive home. The whole encounter probably lasted maybe 20 minutes. But as they drove away, they thought the worst was over.
It wasn't. The biological effects were just beginning to incubate.
Before we get into the sickness, I really want to address the skeptics who might say, well, it was dark. Maybe they just saw a formation of planes and got confused. We have to look at the location data.
Right. John F. Schuessler, who was a primary investigator on this case, he pinpointed the vehicle's location on FM 1485. However, there has been significant debate about the exact coordinates.
So they weren't sure where it happened.
Well, Robert Schieffer, writing for the Skeptical Inquirer, argued that the witnesses couldn't pinpoint the exact spot later, which he suggested meant confusion. But, the confusion about the exact mile marker doesn't negate the independent corroboration of the helicopters.
And that, for many people, is the smoking gun. Because Betty, Vicky, and Colby, they weren't the only ones out there that night.
Correct. This is where Patrolman Lamar Walker enters the file.
A Dayton police officer, a trained observer.
Mm-hmm.
He and his wife, Marie, were in the same area that same night. They didn't see the diamond, but they saw the swarm.
In May of 1982, investigators interviewed Officer Walker, and he confirmed it. He confirmed seeing approximately 12 Chinook-type helicopters flying low in the area. He described one of them as having a bright spotlight shining down, as if it were searching for something.
This is so crucial. You have civilians screaming about a UFO and helicopters, and then you have a police officer saying, look, I didn't see the UFO, but I definitely saw the helicopters. It just anchors the event in reality. The military was there.
It validates the entire second half of the Cash Landrum account. If the helicopters were there, they were there for a reason. And if the military later claims they weren't there, which they did, then the testimony of a police officer becomes a direct challenge to the official government narrative.
There's one other claim about the helicopters that we need to clarify because it often gets, mixed up with the night of December 29th.
You're referring to the pilot encounter.
Exactly. The story goes that months later, in April 1981, a CH-47 Chinook actually landed in Dayton, not far from where the incident occurred.
As a matter of record, a helicopter did land.
And when 7-year-old Colby saw this machine, he naturally panicked. It was the monster from the woods coming back. So Vicky Landrum, in an attempt to help him face his fear, took the boy to the landing site. They waited for the crew to return.
This is where the narrative gets a bit muddy. Vicky claimed that she spoke to the pilot. She alleged that this pilot told her he had been in the area before to check on a UFO in trouble near Huffman.
That sounds like a direct confession.
It does. But we have to be very careful with the timeline here. Investigations into this specific pilot's flight logs and his history suggest that the incident he was referring to, the so-called UFO in trouble, actually occurred in July of 1977.
3 years before.
3 years prior to the Cash Landrum sighting.
So the pilot might have said it, but he was talking about a completely different event.
Precisely. It is highly probable that the witnesses, in their desperate search for answers, conflated the pilot's old story with their very recent trauma. Or perhaps the pilot himself was confused. Either way, it's not a direct admission of involvement in the December 1980 incident.
Okay, so let's move from the sky to the body. This is a biography of injury. When Betty, Vicky, and Colby got home that night, they didn't just go to bed. They began to fall apart.
The onset of the symptoms was rapid, which is clinically very significant. Almost immediately upon returning home, all three experienced nausea.
And then the vomiting and diarrhea.
Yes.
But this wasn't just some stomach bug. They described their skin as burning.
They reported a sensation similar to a severe sunburn, along with a burning sensation in their eyes. This indicates some form of dermal and ocular exposure to an irritant or, some form of radiation.
And Betty Cash, as we noted, was outside the longest, so her reaction was the most violent.
By far.
She collapsed. And over the next few days, her condition didn't improve. It spiraled. She developed large blisters. Her skin was literally bubbling.
The severity of her condition necessitated hospitalization. She was admitted to the hospital on January 3, 1981, just a few days after the encounter. Jerome Clark reports that she was completely unable to walk.
And then there's the detail that everyone remembers about this case, her hair.
Clark's account states that she lost large patches of skin and clumps of hair. And this imagery is very consistent with acute radiation syndrome.
Right.
However, we must pause here and look at the actual medical records objectively.
Okay, so what did the doctor say?
Well, while the documentaries and the later photographs do show significant hair loss, the attending physician's notes from her admission on January 3rd tell a slightly different story. The notes state there was, and I quote, little, if any, hair loss at the time of her admission.
So the hair fell out later?
Yes. It seems it was a delayed reaction occurring weeks into her recovery. The initial diagnosis from her dermatology consultant was not radiation burns.
What was it then?
The diagnosis was cellulitis, a bacterial infection of the skin and severe swelling of the scalp and face.
But cellulitis doesn't usually make your hair fall out in clumps, does it?
Severe inflammation of the scalp can cause temporary hair loss, a condition known as telogen effluvium. But the timing and the pattern are what fueled the radiation theory for so long.
And her ordeal didn't end there.
No. Betty was released after 12 days, but she didn't get better. She had to be readmitted for another 15 days.
And the problems, they just kept coming. In 1983, Betty was treated for breast cancer. Vicky Landrum developed a cataract in one eye just months after the incident. These are long-term systemic failures of the body.
This brings us to the central debate of the medical aftermath. Was it radiation or was it chemical toxicity?
The witnesses and their supporters, they believe they were exposed to ionizing radiation from the object's power source.
And on the surface, it fits.
It does, right. Nausea, hair loss, cataracts, cancer. It reads like a checklist for radiation poisoning.
It does, superficially. But a researcher named Brad Sparks raised a very critical counterargument based on the physics of radiation.
What was that?
For ionizing radiation to cause immediate nausea and vomiting that same night, the dose would have to be absolutely massive. We're talking about a lethal dose.
Meaning they should have died.
If they had received a dose of ionizing radiation high enough to cause immediate vomiting, their bone marrow would have been destroyed. They likely would have died within weeks. The fact that they survived for years, and in Colby's case is still alive today, strongly argues against high-level ionizing radiation.
So if it wasn't a nuclear reactor leaking on them, what was it?
Sparks and others have suggested the symptoms align more closely with chemical contamination, specifically an aerosol exposure.
From the flames.
Exactly. If the object was venting exhaust, remember those flames, that exhaust could have contained hydrazine or other volatile propellants that are used in aerospace applications.
So they were poisoned, not irradiated.
That is the hypothesis. Chemical exposure can cause skin blistering, nausea, eye damage, and severe respiratory issues. It mimics radiation sickness without the necessary lethality of a high-rim dose.
Did anyone test the car? I mean, if this thing blasted them with chemicals or radiation, surely the Oldsmobile was hot.
The Texas Department of Health did investigate. A man named Russ Meyer, the manager of the Bureau of Radiation Control in Houston, he went to the site and he examined the vehicle. His findings were published in the Houston Chronicle. Negative. They found no residual radiation on the car or at the site. Meyer stated that if there had been large amounts of radioactive contamination, some residue would have persisted.
So case closed. It wasn't radiation.
Not entirely. Meyer added a significant caveat.
Which was?
He noted that certain types of radiation, specifically ultraviolet light, infrared light, and low-energy X-rays, do not leave residual traces. They hit you, they damage you, and then they're gone. So the absence of a Geiger counter reading does not prove the absence of an injurious event.
The witnesses, they weren't satisfied with no findings. They were sick, they were hurting, and they wanted answers. So they took this to the top. Vicki Landrum started calling senators.
She contacted Senator Lloyd Benson and Senator John Tower. This is a classic move for citizens who feel abandoned by the bureaucracy. And to an extent, it worked. It forced the military to pay attention.
They were granted an interview at Bergstrom Air Force Base in August 1981. You can just imagine the tension in that room. Two women and a child, scarred and scared, sitting across from a table of Air Force officers.
And the response they received at Bergstrom was very telling. The personnel there, they didn't detain them. They didn't try to silence them. They advised them.
Advised them to do what?
They told the witnesses to hire a lawyer and seek financial compensation.
Which implies the Air Force saw this as a liability issue, not some kind of national security secret.
Exactly. It frames the event as a potential accident involving negligence, rather than a classified encounter.
But the most important investigation, the one that really gives this case its legs, came from the Army. Enter Lieutenant Colonel George Saran.
Saran was with the Office of the Inspector General. His mandate was simple: to determine if Army assets were involved in this. In 1982, he conducted a thorough inquiry.
And his report is just fascinating because it doesn't dismiss the witnesses at all.
Quite the opposite. Saran's conclusion was explicit. He stated, and I'm quoting, "Mrs. Landrum and Mrs. Cash were credible." He also interviewed the police officer, Lamar Walker, and found him credible as well. Saran wrote that there was no perception that anyone was trying to exaggerate the truth.
That is a massive validation. You have the Army Inspector General saying these people aren't lying.
Yes, but there is a second half to that conclusion, a very frustrating second half.
What's that?
While he believed the people, he could not find the machines. Saran searched all the flight logs. He checked unit deployments. He could find absolutely no evidence that the helicopters described, those CH-47s, belonged to the Army, the Air Force, or the National Guard.
So we have credible witnesses seeing phantom helicopters.
That is the paradox of the Saran report. He validated the event's occurrence through witness credibility, but could not validate the hardware through any official documentation.
Of course, where there are believers, there are always skeptics. And the Cash Landrum case, it attracted the heavy hitters of the debunking world. Philip J. Klass, the famous aviation journalist and skeptic, took a very hard look at this.
Klass focused on the medical data. He pointed out what he saw as a fundamental flaw in the legal argument: the lack of a baseline. There were no detailed medical records for Betty Cash prior to the incident.
So we don't know if she was already sick.
That is the implication. Without a clean bill of health dated December 28, 1980, it is medically and legally very difficult to prove that the cancer or the hair loss was caused solely by the event on December 29th.
And then Brian Dunning, much more recently, in 2018, he took this even further.
Dunning analyzed the doctor's notes and suggested that Betty's hair loss was actually due to alopecia areata, which is an autoimmune disease. He argued that her other symptoms could be attributed to pre-existing conditions that just flared up due to the extreme stress of the event.
Then there's the mirage theory. Stuart Campbell came out in 1994 and said it wasn't a UFO, it was a star.
Campbell suggested they saw a mirage of the star Canopus, which astronomically would have been aligned with the road that night.
But a star doesn't roar. A star doesn't shoot fire down at you. A star doesn't melt your dashboard.
Correct. The mirage theory addresses the initial visual stimulus of a bright light, but completely fails to account for the multisensory nature of the report: the heat, the sound, the vibration, and of course the independent helicopter sightings.
There is a psychological angle here that Dunning brings up, which I think is important to address, this idea of the just settlement.
This is a powerful human motivator. If you believe you have been injured by the government and you're facing these mounting medical bills, you need a villain. You need someone to pay. Dunning suggests that the witnesses might have wrongly, but honestly, attributed their health problems to the object. They weren't lying, but they were desperate to connect the dots in a way that would result in some kind of financial relief.
And that desperation, it leads us directly to the courtroom. This is, I think, the only UFO case I know of that turned into a massive federal lawsuit.
It is certainly the most prominent. Betty Cash and Vicki Landrum filed a suit against the United States federal government. They were asking for $20 million in damages.
They were represented by Peter Gersten, a lawyer who is known for taking on these kinds of fringe cases. He did it pro bono.
And the lawsuit moved the incident out of the tabloids and into the United States District Court. This meant the government couldn't just ignore it. They had to testify. Officials from NASA, the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy were all deposed.
What was the government's defense? Did they say it was a weather balloon?
No. Their defense was much simpler and much more effective. It was denial of possession. They argued, under oath, that no such diamond-shaped object existed in the U.S. inventory. They argued that no military personnel were operating helicopters in that area on that night.
Just a flat, it wasn't us.
It wasn't us.
Yeah.
And in a court of law, the burden of proof rests on the plaintiff. Cash and Landrum had to prove that the object was a U.S. government asset.
But how do you prove that? I mean, if it's a secret project, there are no records. And if there are no records, you lose the lawsuit.
That is exactly what happened. On August 21st, 1986, the legal battle ended. A U.S. District Court judge dismissed the case.
And the reason?
The judge was persuaded by the military testimony. He ruled that since no U.S. agency admitted to possessing the craft and the plaintiffs could not produce a serial number or a pilot, there was simply no case to answer.
So they walked away with absolutely nothing. No money, no apology, just the scars.
The dismissal closed the legal avenue completely. It left the origin of the object as an open variable. The government had effectively washed its hands of the Piney Woods incident.
Now we look at the legacy. The biography of this event, it really ends with the deaths of the witnesses. Betty Cash never gave up. She kept talking. She went on unsolved mysteries. She went on sightings. She wanted the world to know what happened to her.
Her health continued to decline over the years. And then there's the final strange coincidence of the timeline. Betty Cash passed away on December 29th, 1998.
December 29th. Exactly 18 years to the day after the encounter.
It's a poetic, if tragic, bookend to her life. She was 69 years old.
Vicki Landrum, she lived a bit longer. She survived Betty by nearly a decade. She died on September 12, 2007. She was 83.
And Colby Landrum,
Yeah.
the boy in the backseat.
He carried that night with him his whole life. In 2009, he appeared on the show UFO Hunters. He's still out there, the last living witness to the fire in the woods.
As we close the file on this, we have to look at where we stand. The Cash Landrum incident is completely unique. We have the Army Inspector General stating the witnesses are credible. We have a physically melted dashboard. We have a police officer who saw the helicopters.
But we have no paper trail, no confession, and a medical mystery that will never truly be solved because the bodies are gone.
Texas Monthly categorized it as having no conclusive explanation to this day. That is accurate. It is a baffling mix of solid, tangible evidence and absolute dead ends.
It's a reminder, isn't it, that in the deep woods, on a dark night, things can happen that leave a mark on your car, on your body, and on your life, and the government can simply say, it wasn't us, and that's just the end of the story.
The sobering thought.
Thank you for joining us on this examination of the Cash Landrum files. Thanks for listening.